I don't know how many of you believe in demons or the supernatural, but I was a skeptic for most of my life, including my time as a park ranger. That is until the summer of 2013, when I had the oddest experience I've ever had in my lifetime, even today. For the story, you can call me Hank. I work as a state park ranger in Alabama. I've been doing this job for 14 years and have seen every manner of wildlife you could imagine. The things I'm going to describe are strange. I know how crazy they'll sound, but I assure you, this is exactly what I saw. I started my shift like any other. I did some cleaning, made some repairs, and had a chat with some of the locals. Growing up, I had always loved nature, so it was natural that I got a job as a park ranger. If you love nature, it's one of the most important things you can do, and it's the best job you can get. After lunch, I patrolled the area and watched the wildlife. It was while walking that I heard something behind me. I turned around and saw a dog. You're probably going to tell yourself right now, "Oh, that's so sweet. A doggy." You are probably mentally petting the dog right now, right? Well, trust me, you wouldn't want to rub this thing. It looked like a Doberman, but its fur was all black. This dog sat on all fours and was my height. Keep in mind, I'm 6'2". I remember being weirded out, thinking, okay, someone lost their dog. The thing is, though, I couldn't see anyone nearby, and the vibes this dog gave off were absolutely creepy. It wasn't just its unnatural height, but an almost dead sort of feeling that hung around. I would compare it to dread and the fear of death put together. It was just emanating from this thing. I slowly approached the dog anyway, hoping that I could find its owner or help it out. Despite my feelings about the dog, it's just an animal, and I'm an animal lover. As I approached the dog, it got up and left. The dog moved quickly, and I could not keep up with it. I reported seeing this dog to a few of the other rangers, and they said they'd keep an eye out. The remainder of my shift was pretty mundane. A few weeks passed, and I saw the dog again while I was on another patrol. It was a bit far away, just sitting on all fours and staring. It wasn't staring at me, per se, but more like it was overlooking the park itself. I was curious and radioed out that I had spotted the dog again. The second I radioed this, the dog looked in my direction. I'm not talking about it quickly turning its way and looking at me. I mean, literally, with this most unusual calm, deliberate, and slow head turn, it looked at me. It got up, ran, and then was gone. I told the other rangers where it was and tried to give the exact location, but I don't know. I don't think they ever found it. We decided we'd go about our business and keep an eye out. Once again, the rest of the work week came and went. For the next 2 weeks, there was no sighting of the dog. Then on a Tuesday morning in August, something very odd happened. I saw this dog again. It reappeared in a hurry. I quickly ran in the direction I saw the dog move and radioed to the other rangers that I could see the dog again. It didn't take long for everyone to meet up, and just up the hill, the dog sat there, its back to us, looking down at something. We rushed up the hill and looked over to see someone lying on their back, motionless. We immediately called the paramedics, and I ran around to start CPR. I tried with all my might to help this person, but I believed they were just too far gone. The paramedics arrived to find a lifeless body and many of us looking sullen and distraught. I remember trying to hold back tears and repeating that I tried over and over. I'm sure I was a bit of a mess, but as I was brought over to be checked out by paramedics, I remember someone trying to question me. It all tuned out in my head. You know how in the movies, during scenes of trauma, how sometimes people will be talking, and it's like mute to the character. That's the best way I can describe that moment. I could see the paramedic's lips moving, but no sound was coming out. I was thinking about way too many things at that moment, many of them jumbled, as I was in shock. But I came to rather quickly when I saw something even more shocking. Up on the hill, the dog stood there. Next to the dog was a woman in a black dress. My first thought was that maybe that was the owner and the dog did have, a family after all. That's when I saw something I couldn't even begin to believe. Despite seeing it with my own eyes, I still don't believe it. The body we found was a woman. The woman currently being taken away to the morgue was a young jogger who looked like she could be in her early 30s, with blonde hair and a long ponytail. I'll never forget her blue eyes as they stared at me from the hill. She looked comfortable, relaxed even. I remember staring and pointing at the mountain, but no words would come out of my mouth. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't get a word out. The paramedics looked into the distance, but didn't seem to see anything. I, however, saw the dog, the woman in black, and the jogger. I also watched them turn and walk away until I could see them no longer. I tried running up the hill. I looked high and low until I was eventually rounded up again by the police and paramedics, and I found no sign of anyone. I tried to explain what I saw when I could finally speak again and make sense. I was probably told it was probably a side effect of my shock, and I probably didn't actually see anything. I'm pretty sure what I saw was real, and I'm unsure of how to explain it. It was easily the strangest series of events I've ever experienced. I still work with the park rangers, and I love my job. I haven't seen the dog or the woman since, and I have no idea what more to say. I worked in forest maintenance and forest agriculture for quite some time. Some friends of mine owned a big plot of land in the Rocky Mountains. A group of us, all guys between 18 and 38 years of age, would gather several times a year, go into the mountains for several days, and clear shrub brush, make fire breaks, and, when appropriate, cut Christmas trees. This particular time, it was early spring, and our crew of 9 on 3 Gator 4-wheel drive vehicles was about 9,200 feet in elevation. On this mountain, there was a significant amount of snow on the ground. We had put in a long day's work, and we were headed to camp until the old guy on the crew asked if we wanted to head to someplace called the slope. This was a near treeless slope, free of large rocks, about 100 yards wide, with tracks of giant trees on either side. We would tow a tube downhill in the snow using one of the gators. It was actually a lot of fun. We got to the slope, set up a fire pit, cracked open the whiskey, and started having a great time. We all took several turns being towed. Jeff was the new guy and the youngest at 18. We were giving him the craziest rides, swinging him close to the trees to freak him out, an initiation of sorts. It was about 1 a.m., pitch black except for our dying fire, and lightly snowing. Not the smartest or the safest thing I've ever done, but one of the most fun. Just as we were wrapping up one of the last rides and heading back to camp, Jeff freaked the hell out. He was stumbling over his words and couldn't express himself very clearly, but finally, he got the words out. 3/4 of the way down, he had seen a man standing a few yards into the woods. He said he was wearing a trapper hat, one of those with the flipped-up bill and ear flaps, like in Fargo, and a plaid mackinaw. We were all skeptical. We were on a big plot of private property at an elevation that was somewhat hostile. But we took the rifles off the gators, got our flashlights out, and looked around. We didn't find anything, not even footprints. We chalked it up to the inexperienced, spooky environment, and, of course, the whiskey, and headed back to the camp about 1/8 of a mile away. Jeff didn't sleep all night. He was convinced he had actually seen someone. The following day, we drove the gators to the house on the property, got in our trucks, and headed to town, which was not very far, for some nice breakfast. We had our breakfast and were heading back to the property to say our goodbyes and go our separate ways. As we neared the intersection of the public dirt road and the private dirt drive to the house, there were several police cars and ambulances. We stopped to talk to the police, who informed us that the closest neighbors had found a body in the ditch as they were heading down the mountain. Police had followed and reversed the footprints up the hill to the slope and then came across the neighboring property to another perpendicular road. They asked if we had seen anything, and we told them about the Mackinac man. Sure enough, it was him. Self-inflicted gunshot, probably just minutes after we encountered him. I still don't know what he wanted, if he was dangerous, or if we could have helped. Poor Jeff got his whiskey and meals paid for the next several weeks. For a little backstory, Daniel was my childhood best friend from my neighborhood, and he lived in the building next to mine in 1993, if I remember correctly. But we all called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, his stepfather, and he moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by mountains and woods on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city, on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas all around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because, as they were driving in his mom's car, he could see lots of places where he could play and explore. As a kid, that was very exciting. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day and while the sun was up, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were really scary. He felt an ominous presence from those woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things, like the dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs, cats, spiders, sharks, you name it, just like me. And this was because he was a total mama's boy, and at 5 years old, what do you expect? When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us and talking to EAC star other. We immediately bonded and became friends because we had a lot of things in common. We started talking about our favorite TV shows and movies, such as *Wars*, Dragon Ball Z, the X-Men cartoons, and Ninja Turtles, among many others. So, we used to play by pretending we were superheroes or some sort of cartoon character while running around, using the merry-go-round, the slides, and the swings. And, funny enough, we both had plastic lightsabers, so we fought as if we were Jedis or Ninja Turtles. But we never stayed in the park once the sun went down, either because our babysitters did not let us, or we were just too scared, honestly. However, Dan was not my only friend in the neighborhood. I introduced him to my other friends who lived in my building and other buildings and houses. Their names were Eliza, Diego, JP, Mike, Laura, and Gerard. All of us were around the same age, and we all became great friends as the months went by, because almost every afternoon, we played sports, played in the park, trick-or-treated, had water balloon fights, played Nintendo together, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day, and did everything together. The neighborhood kids liked to joke around by saying that the woods behind the buildings were haunted. At that time, we played hide and seek, or cops and robbers, so we ran around the street until 7 p.m., because that was our curfew, and we had to do our boring homework after that. But Dan and I stayed up late at night in secret while we talked quietly on the phone. That night, it was around 9 or 10 p.m., I think, Dan asked me the following: "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude, of course. I would not miss it for the world." "Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the 4 Horsemen?" "Yeah, dude, that fight was awesome. I loved it." But talking about something else, have you heard some creepy noises behind your building at night? No, bro, I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out. Wow. I wish I was that lucky. I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk sometimes. Well, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow. Take care, bro. Sure thing, man. Talk to you tomorrow. Take care. Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down on his bed, grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand, and started reading it until he began to close his eyes and doze off. He fell into a deep sleep and was now dreaming, or so he thought. In his dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest, but he was woken up by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath them, as if some person or animal was walking in the woods. There were a lot of cats in the neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats, potentially maybe a possum or an owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him and said, "Daniel, it is Professor X. The X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange but yet familiar voice was very similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside of his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots, took his glasses, got out of his apartment, and went to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little cold, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow, he felt extremely attracted to this voice like metal to a magnet, because he could not get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He then felt very scared, but kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. While he was walking, he heard other footsteps and leaves crunching beside him. He felt like these steps were approaching his position. At that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly, since he thought it was some crazy person or an animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. There were a lot of cats in this neighborhood, like I said. So Dan thought it was one of those cats. Maybe it was some other sort of animal. But then he heard a noise that sounded like a roar. He thought it sounded very similar to those dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. He had recently seen that movie in theaters, so it was the closest thing he could think of. Suddenly, he heard fast steps from somebody or something running in his direction. Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out. Unfortunately, when he hit the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder, so he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him, circled his location, and then sniffed the air to get his scent, but Dan guessed it decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours because he was woken up by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree. The heat and glare from the sun on his face woke him up. He rubbed his eyes, opened them, and looked all around him. He was in shock and horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw that it was 6 a.m. He had woken up in the middle of the forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because he was dreaming, but he had sleepwalked into the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushed the leaves from his arms and legs, and ran away from that creepy forest, which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got to his parking lot. He ran to his building's door, opened it, ran to the elevator, and saw himself in the mirror and could not believe what had happened to him. Dan got to his apartment door, opened it silently, tiptoed inside the apartment's hallway, and saw that, thankfully, his mother and stepfather had not woken up yet. He went to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what occurred last night. He completely believed his parents when they told him not to listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. So Dan had many questions, and thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know he would listen to it? How did it know he loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out, or maybe he would. Who knows?